There. Okay. Hi, everyone. Aw, I love this so much. It's so nice to see you. As you all know, this is what I'd hoped our term would have looked like way back in January when we started, right? That we'd have our Tuesdays where you would be working through materials I'd be posting, working on readings, preparing for class discussions. And then on Thursdays, we would get to sit in a space like this and have some conversations. Um, as things played out, that wasn't quite how this worked out, but I'm really glad that at least we have today to kind of replicate a bit more of what a normal classroom environment would be like. And I just wanted to share again my thanks for your patience and everything else, your understanding throughout this term, not only with shifting modalities and all of that communication, and then also with my leave as well. So I just wanted to thank all of you for that this term. So I think overall it's still been a pretty productive course. I've been really enjoying reading your revised proposals and seeing what you're all been working on. So I'm really excited to see what the next few weeks are going to look like as we get into presentations. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more today, is just go over the requirements, again, expectations in terms of presentations, make sure that's all really clear, talk a little bit about the peer review of the presentations, and then finally the final projects as well. Okay. After we're done going through those, have a chance to ask questions, of course, throughout that you folks have with me. We'll get into this week's materials, and hopefully we can talk about summarizing some of the other major themes that we've seen in this course. And then that will be it for today. The only other thing I have to begin with is it's because, again, it's one of those things where unfortunately I didn't have the opportunity to bring this into a physical classroom environment when it was actually ongoing. But I don't know if you folks know that MacEwan is a partner with the Moose Hide campaign. Has anyone ever heard about the Moose Hide campaign? Two of you might have? Okay. So I'm just going to read quickly the little blurb here, because I think, when representing something that you're not part of, it's best to use the actual words that are associated with it. So I first found out about the Moose Hide campaign through one of my partners, and was able to put in a request. And then they shipped these to me to distribute to you folks for free. So this is, federal government is funding this, but so I just thought I'd put this out here. Don't feel like I didn't pay for this. So I don't want to take any credit for this at all. Okay, this is just me doing my job as a white woman to get materials and information out to other people, and using my privilege as an educator to request these things to get them in your hands. Okay, so I just wanted to say that, because I didn't want people like, oh, that was so kind of you. No, this is literally the least thing I can do. Okay, one of the least things I can do. So the Moose Hide campaign was originally a grassroots movement, and now it has a lot of federal support here in Canada. So as such, it's kind of grown a little bit larger, but they're still really trying to keep it at kind of, like the small organizer level, and not have basically the government take it over outright. And it was a movement created and led by Indigenous men and boys, and now has grown to incorporate Indigenous and non-Indigenous men and boys who want to signal and display their commitment to standing up against gender-based violence directed towards women and girls. So this is a grassroots men's movement to show solidarity and to recognize their own roles that they have to play in breaking the cycle of violence. So I think that's really great. So by wearing one of these pieces of moose hide, it signifies your commitment to honor, respect, and protect the women and children in your life, and to work together with other men and boys to end violence against women and children. And you can help spread awareness, and that's what I'm trying to do as a woman, right? Not as a man, by sharing with family, communities, and organizations. And so they again very kindly provided to me to provide to my classroom, so I've been giving these out today. So these ones here that are a bit more textures, these are actual pieces of moose hide. And so there's those. And then for those of you who are a bit more, trying to think of the appropriate way to say this that doesn't like devalue. It's so hard as an anthropologist sometimes, but anyways, for those of you who might have concerns about wearing animal-based products, yeah, let's put it that way. I also ordered some of their, I think it's like naga hide or something, so it's a material that they have chosen to kind of represent symbolically the same thing as a moose hide, but without wearing a product that comes directly from animals. There, I did that well. So what I'm going to do is just put these out. Again, if you would like to pick them up for yourself or for the men and boys in your life who would be interested in wearing the symbol of solidarity, of signaling their support for ending gender-based violence. These are up here. So I'll just leave them at the front and feel free to help yourself. You can take as many or as little as you want. I'll also mention that as well, because when I handed them out in 110 this morning, or had them out in 110, someone's like, is it okay if I take 2? I was like, yes, that's what they're here for. So please feel free to take them, and the card and all the wonderful social media information, contact information, whatnot, for the lovely folks behind this movement is also on the cards as well. But if you Google Moose Hide movement, or Moose Hide, what do they call it? Moose Hide campaign. There we go. That's what I was looking for. You can, folks can get that there. So there you go. So I was originally going to have that for when we had our like Sexual Violence Awareness Week and stuff like that on campus, but of course, because we don't have that right now and we weren't able to get together over that week, so there's that. Also, happy belated Pride, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't celebrate Pride with you. I was so looking forward to it. I had my new Pride glasses, I had all my Pride gear, and then of course I was at home recovering. So as you can see, I am not fully recovered yet, but I'm recovered enough to be back at work. I was talking about this 110 this morning, that I think there's a lot of symbolism in my own personal experience, and in that I found it extremely challenging to be away from work for even just 3 weeks. I made it about a week before I started checking email. I made it 2 weeks before I created a study guide and a midterm exam. And then I made it about, 3 weeks, and then I came back. So here I am. Yeah, so I'm mostly recovered. One thing you might notice, but you might have noticed it with your other professors as well, is that I'm not used to delivering this way anymore. It's been a while. But also as part of my procedure, they inflated my abdomen with gas so they could see all my organs and stuff correctly. And so I'm greatly reduced. I don't look like I'm 9 months pregnant anymore. But what it means is that my diaphragm took a beating as well. So I kind of, every once in a while, I might have to take a break because I've basically run out of steam. So, and as a former drama kid and a former theater kid, this is killing me, right? Because I know how to project, I know how to be loud, I know how to sustain this for long periods of time without straining my throat, I know how to do this all properly, and my body is just like, no thank you, how about remember, what you just put us through a couple weeks ago. So anyways, so just thought I'd give you an update that if I need to pause and take a few breaths, I promise I'm not going to pass out on you. It's fine. It's just probably masking isn't helping as well, right? So anyways, for those of you at the back, if you can't hear me, it's not a big deal in this space. Please let me know, and I will project louder if need be, but this room's okay. Except for the weird little corner. Whatever. No one's hiding behind there, so that's good. Although feel free to if you really want. Okay. Before we get into this stuff, though, at least this room has windows. Actually, I quite appreciate that. As most of you know, my office doesn't have windows, so I must admit that's the one downside to coming back to campus and working on campus. Is as much as I love my office, and as those of you again who've seen my office know that I've very much customized it and made it my own little space, I don't have windows in there. So when I come into classrooms that have windows, I'm like, oh yeah, sunlight's amazing, because where I teach from at home in my apartment, I have huge windows there, so it's been kind of weird getting used to being like, oh yeah, there's spaces where windows aren't a thing. So that's nice. Are there any questions for me before we get underway? Polly says her regards, by the way. She says hi. She's very angry with me right now, of course, because I'm not home all day, every day. So we're working through it. It's going to be okay. Yeah, I'm confident it'll be fine. So she's particularly upset because I also don't have Olivia this week. She's at her dad's this week. So she's pretty angry because she's like, wait, you're gone and the other one is gone too? So it's okay. We'll be okay. Little old ladies, right? You just got to give them space to vent their feelings, and it'll be okay. And I'll give her lots of love. But as I know everyone cares about her, I thought I better let you all know that she sends her regards and she misses you all, and she's also very angry with me. So we'll get over this. Okay, questions for me. Does anyone have any questions before we get underway? Before we get started? No? Okay. Well, if you do, of course, at any time, please throw up your hand, let me know, and we'll go from there. Oh, yeah, and of course, as I already mentioned, thanks everyone for wearing your masks. I will continue to wear my masks for the remainder of the term, just because I think we're all under a lot of pressure right now, and the last thing any of us need is to get any sort of cold of any kind. And I'm still technically a little vulnerable right now, so I've been continuing to mask and stuff like that. So thanks for helping keep me safe. I very much appreciate it, everyone. So But again, if it seems to be a problem in terms of clarity, understanding me, please let me know. And I'll talk about masking for presentations once we get to that. Basically, if you would like to unmask for your presentation while up at the podium, starting our presentation, you're more than welcome to do that, right? It's all based on your own comfort levels. But if you'd like to mask, I will, of course, also consider that when I'm evaluating you on your presentation skills. I will not penalize you for wearing a mask, okay? So just get that out of the way. Of course, it's going to impact your ability to emote a little bit, but we have other ways of being engaging, right? Song dance. Also, this, by the way, was the dress that I bought for you folks that I was going to wear on our very first day of the term. It was my start of the term dress. And then, thank you. I just mentioned it because, yeah, it was one of those things where, again, I was so excited to be back into a hybrid modality, back into classrooms. I'm like, I'm going to buy myself a little outfit, matching mask. It's going to be great. And then we didn't get the January we wanted. So anyway, so I'm honoring you, and I'm honoring my commitment to you folks by wearing it today. So again, okay, let's talk about assignments. And note that, yeah, okay. This recording I am currently doing is for a pedagogical examination I am doing as an educator for my annual report, and as such does not violate the directive I've been given and my colleagues have been given to not record in-person lectures and post them. I am also doing this to facilitate, as I should, because I honor and respect these and incorporate them in my classroom, ADR accommodations for students who cannot actually attend and join us in person. So if you're just wondering why I am recording this, this is why I am doing it, and I swear I am following the rules, right? Awesome. Okay. So it's going to be a bit weird because you're going to see me, and I'm going to see me, and it's going to be weird. But okay. Okay. Enough about that. Let's move me. See, and the problem is I don't think I can change it. I think once I'm in here, I'm in here. Okay. Anyways, oops. If you thought I was awkward on a computer fighting with things, wait till you see me in person. Okay. Oh my goodness, how nice is it to hear all of you folks again, too? Jeez. Okay, wait, it's not letting me zoom in. Okay, well, can you kind of see this? Is this zoomed in enough? Okay, now Word's not responding. Great. Okay. So one of the things I was going to do was I need to research a new teaching computer, but then I didn't because I was trying to listen. Oh, by the way, if you're concerned that I worked too much when I was on leave, I can, if you would like, post my Nintendo Switch data that shows that I did spend potentially an extensive period of time on Animal Crossing. I'm just saying, okay? So I promise you I did not only work over my medical leave. I actually did spend, I read 7 books, folks. I read 7 books. Okay, so quickly, book review. If you like historical fiction dealing with very loose interpretations of some historical figures from the various dynastic eras of China, and you like giant robots who have to fight invading aliens and are all for polyamorous and bisexual representation, you should read the book called Iron Widow. It's kind of like, it read to me kind of like young adult fiction because it's awesome. The main character is all about is all angry because she's a woman, and she, of course her foot were bound so that she would be marriage equality, and she hates it, and she hates the system, and she's raging against the patriarchy, and she takes this rage out by deciding that if she gets her chance, she is going to murder everyone she can, hopefully using these giant robots. It's glorious, to say the least. I read it in 2 days because I made myself stop reading it because I loved it so much. So anyways, it's a great read. So I'm throwing it out there. D&D nerds, Canadian author. You want to read a book called, why am I blanking on it now? Something of the Wild. Or anyways, it's on my Instagram. And it's basically about a bunch of friends who have to get the band back together because it looks like, the big bad evil has come back type thing. And again, it is another like total guilt-free book. So basically, as you're leading into this final exams period, final projects and everything, remember that I know while it's easier said than done, that give yourself these little moments of joy, of happiness, of disconnect from the work. You may think, oh, I don't have an hour, I don't have a half hour to take care of myself. As someone who has experienced burnout, yes, you do. You may think you don't, but if it'll catch up with you later on. Okay, so anyways, okay, there's my book reviews, Mama Bearness, done this. Okay, we've covered everything but course materials. Okay, course materials. Clearly, I'm back to in person, right? Because it's just I'm derailing the lecture before we even get started. Okay, presentation. Okay, so the majority of you have read these instructions. How do I know you read these instructions? Because you signed up for a presentation slot. Awesome. Okay, a couple of you still haven't. Reminder that even if you're doing a pre-recorded presentation, I'd like you to upload a slot or select a slot just because that helps me with tracking and also in terms of due dates for this assignment. Okay, it's just an order thing. Yes, it's kind of technically a formality, but I need you to do this for me. Okay, so what are you? Oh, wait, this is presentation peer review. We don't even want this one. We want presentation. Yay. Oh, there we go. That's the presentation. Okay, for some reason, it's this computer, the menu bar covers up the bottom of my other windows and I can't seem to get to them, whatever. Anyways, okay. So, assuming my computer is going to work, maybe not. Okay, see, it's not just Blackboard. Maybe all the technological issues are me. Okay, so as you've already seen, two options, right? A pre-recorded presentation or a live presentation. So I just wanted to reiterate some key points about your presentations, because many of you might be looking at having to make them because they start next week, right? So first and foremost is that I do not expect, nor do I evaluate you on the basis of you presenting a final completed project, okay? So first and foremost, I wanted to reiterate that, right? That this is going to be your last opportunity to get feedback from myself and your peers before submitting your final project. So if you have not completed your research yet, if you're still working on your paper, if your essay is still in a fragmentary form as you're pulling pieces together, that's okay, okay? That's also why I'm only giving you 10 minutes to do your presentation, is I'm not looking for this perfect, well fleshed out, here's my thesis, here are my methods, here's the data I used, here's my analysis, here's my discussion, here's my conclusion, here's my results, okay? That's not the expectation. Essentially, what I want you to focus on is the key, what we call the key deliverables about your proposal, about your project, right? So what this means is your presentation can take a couple of different forms. Now, consistently, what do I want to see? Some sort of visuals, right? So you need to have some sort of PowerPoint, slides, something like that, in which you are presenting some information for the class to see, right? There needs to be an oral component. So again, you're either presenting it live in classroom on the Thursdays, or you're recording your voice and uploading it as part of your presentation, your video, your saved video on Blackboard. Preferably, you should also have some sort of visual component in terms of you, right? So as I'm sure you've seen, watching a recorded video where there's no people involved in it is kind of dry and static, right? And so one of the things I'm looking for is like your presence in your presentation, because I want to give you feedback on presentation skills as well. And vocalization is only one part of that, right? That said, keep in mind that this is me, Dr. Biittner. I am not expecting polished, practiced, perfected presentation skills. You are all still in the process of developing these skills. And for some of you, this might be your first time actually having to do a recording or a presentation in front of a group of people. So I will not downgrade you for normal human responses for public speaking, which I still think is in the top 3 of the most common fears that humans have. I think it's still like spiders, public speaking, and death, okay? So I get it, okay? I still have moments where public speaking is incredibly difficult for me. And I've talked about this before, right? Classrooms, I don't care. This is my space. I have a lot of power here. I'm fine, right? I've given smaller talks or had to go to social occasions and events where I am a sweaty, red-faced, rambly, incoherent mess. It's okay. Okay, so If you say a lot, if you have other verbal tics and stuff, that's okay too, right? I might comment on it, but they're not going to impact your grade. Okay, what I'm looking for instead, again, is a good attempt made to do a presentation, to use proper, appropriate language, to be engaging, and to clearly communicate your main ideas. Okay, so we'll get that stuff out of the way here as well. Okay, so you have some options though and flexibility in terms of how your presentation could play out as well. It might be more like a formal lecture where you're like, hey, here's my major idea, here are some of the things I've looked at, and here are some conclusions I'm trending toward as I'm writing up my paper. For those of you doing on essays, it may look a bit different. So I believe I mentioned this before, but you may want to use your presentation as an opportunity to beta test the game you're developing, right? To share some of the plot points you're developing for your short story that you're writing, maybe get some feedback on where the direction should go. If you're creating an art piece where you're concerned about equity and diversity and inclusion, getting opinion of an educated group of folks, right, who can say, hey, have you considered having a different bodied person represented in your images? Looks like you did a great job of representing genders and ethnicities, but what about showing different kinds of abilities? How might you capture that, right? So this is an opportunity for you to present again your project, still in somewhat of a rough form, but definitely, hopefully, I should say hopefully, not definitely, but hopefully a little bit more progressed from your initial proposals, right? To a community of, again, informed peers, right? So what does that mean too? It means that you don't have to go back and spend your presentation defining major core concepts, right? So I wouldn't expect someone to be like, okay, so gender is defined as, archaeology is, right? Keep in mind who your audience is. That's the kinds of things that I am considering, okay? So 10 minutes. How you want to use that 10 minutes is up to you then, right? So if you're doing a play test or some sort of demonstration, maybe it's 5 minutes of talking, 5 minutes of discussion, right? Maybe you start with, hey, I'm going to send you folks in without having any background. Here's an activity I've developed. I would like you all to work on this. And then after a few minutes, we're going to come back as a group and talk about it. Maybe you're just going to talk for 10 minutes. Maybe you're going to talk for 7 minutes, leave 3 minutes for questions. That structure is up to you, okay? But remember the goal, communicating the key ideas, key themes of your project. Remember, and I'm going to mention this again in terms of your final project, something I see, and it's not just you folks, it's every single term I teach this class, is remember that this is not just a course on gender, it's a course on gender and archaeology. So really bring that forward. Make sure that that is clear, right? Make sure it's clear how gender and how archaeology are interrelated and connected and explained or examined through your research project, okay? So if you only want to talk about one of those things, then you need to make it very clear and make a pretty good argument as to why you're only focusing on one or the other as well, okay? Again, keep in mind, I'm not expecting perfection with these presentations. It's part of the learning curve. It's an important skill to develop, but these are the kinds of things I wanted to just bring to your attention because I've had some questions, which has been great, emails, office hours, but also just my experience in past courses and past incarnations of this class. Are there any questions about the presentations then? So yes, here, just because that's how I saw hands go.
So our final presentation won't be shown to the class, it's just getting submitted to you.
Exactly, yeah. So this is the kind of weird thing about this kind of hybrid modality I'm trying out, is that those of you who upload video ones, and this relates to the other assignment, the peer review assignment, okay, is that those are not going to be shown in a live classroom time. Instead, what I'm asking you to do is, and sorry, I can't log in right now because I forgot my phone and the dual authentication system won't let me log in, but I posted a note on Blackboard that kind of walks you through the steps as to how to share the link of your video to the whole class so they can observe it. So basically what I did was I created a Google Doc that has all of the Tuesday time slots on it. And what you do is you find your Tuesday's time slot that you signed up for, and you're just going to put your name and then the Google link to your video file so people can access it. Yeah, so unfortunately, people who submit video ones, the only person I can guarantee will see all of your videos, at least once, will be me, right? But what I'm hoping is that you'll scroll through a couple of the other ones, watch a couple of the other ones as part of the peer review assignment, to give feedback on them, and that everyone will get to see at least one of their pre-recorded videos. And then the one that we do live in class, of course, the whole class will have access to seeing. So I don't know if this is going to work out, if I'm going to like this. And I think I mentioned this before the break, that the reason why I decided to do it this way was to allow people the option to not give a live presentation, because public speaking, again, not everyone's cup of tea, but also B, because again, consistency and predictability is extremely important in these high flex formats. I didn't want to all of a sudden in March force you folks to come on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? So what I'm hoping and what I'm highly recommending is that on Tuesday, like when we normally have our class time, you would take that time, because you're not reviewing lecture notes, there won't be any posted, I won't be posting a lecture video, there's no readings for you to do, that you'll spend a bit of your time and watch some of your peers' videos and provide some feedback, okay? So to give the feedback, it's fairly straightforward. I've provided a link instead, and so you have to give feedback on 3 different presentations. To kind of encourage you to do this, what I would like to see is, and what I recommend is that one of the presentations that you give your feedback for is a recorded one, okay? Remember that we have 3 weeks worth though, right? So don't all rush out and do only the first weeks, okay? I'll talk about that in a second. That you do one of the live or in-person presentations. Now the reason for that, for doing one review of each of those different forms, is that, as you'll see, is that of course you can evaluate different attributes, right? And you can assess different kind of presentation skills and qualities and aspects in recorded versus other ones. So I think it's important to do different kinds of peer reviews, right? So you've done peer reviews on written work, now you're giving them on formal work, okay? Your third review then, what I would recommend, but again, it's not in the instructions, so I'm not going to require it this late, but I'd highly recommend it, is do it on your proposal peer partner, because you've already reviewed their work once. I know if they've made the changes you recommended or not. You might not, right? You probably don't. You probably didn't see their resubmitted work, because I didn't require you folks to do that. I think it's really worthwhile that you give them feedback on it again, because the only other person who knows your proposal better than me is your peer review partner, right? So that's at least one other person. So does that make sense? So one pre-recorded video, one in person, and then your peer review partner, right? So you can just go back and find out who that is. If you don't want to do theirs again, it's okay. Like I said, I'm not going to be formally grading you on that component. The only thing I'm going to be grading you on is, like what I'm doing with assignment 2, is the quality of the feedback you give. I'm almost done marking assignment 2, so all of you should have assignment 3 marked now and have the feedback. Sorry, originally I didn't click this one tiny little button in the rubric. It's like the tiniest little thing that allows you to see the feedback, so I've adjusted that. So if originally you didn't see my little comments, you should be able to see that now. I fixed that. And then I'm almost done your assignment 2, which is giving you feedback on your feedback, so I'll get there. So those will be done by the end of tomorrow, if not the end of today, so you'll get that back. And then I'll be assessing you on this. So I'll be a little bit more critical of your feedback for these, because you've already had the opportunity to practice peer review, etc., etc. Okay? So any questions about this? So again, the trick is that the feedback you're submitting is via a link. Okay? So I've created a Google Doc. It basically has the same questions you already saw, or similar-ish. They've just been tweaked or adjusted for an oral presentation versus a written piece. So you just click on that link. You'll go in, you'll submit 1, go in, redo the form, submit 2, resubmit 3. Okay, it's really easy to do. And there's even a little button you can click if you'd like to see your responses and keep a copy of that, okay? So I will get a copy that way. So you're not uploading anything to Blackboard for your peer reviews for this, okay? So I thought I'd make that clear. It's all going to go through the Google Docs, and then I will download them and go through all the grading. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I just did that because it's easier in a number of different ways to do it in this format. Plus, it allows you, so I'd recommend that next Thursday when we're doing these in-person presentations, that you bring your device, right? And you can be filling out the form right as people are giving their talks, okay? The only other thing I'll say is this. So the reason why I'd like you to do your peer review partners is that means that everyone will get at least one piece of peer feedback. because otherwise there might be the potential that like the first presenter on Thursday gets 50 feet or 30 or 40 feedback, and everybody else in that day doesn't get any, right? So I'd like everyone to get at least one. So if you do your partners, then at least they'll get one person's. But anyways, you'll get mine as well, so it's all good. Is feel free, you can always do more. Okay, so I will only mark you on 3 of them. So if you want to do them for every single presentation, go for it. That'd be really great and generous of you, but I don't expect nor require you to do that. I think 3 is more than enough. Okay? Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, sorry. You did have questions.
For assignment 5 for the presentation, can you have like a briefing note, like a script in a sense, and then
Totally.
And a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Is it okay if you have just images on the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's absolutely. What the structure of your PowerPoint is, what you choose to put in it, is all up to your discretion and is all things we'll comment on. Yeah. One thing I highly recommend, and I commented on many people's timelines, give yourself time to practice. Okay? Regardless if you're filming or doing it live. So yeah, if you have a script, if you're going to be speaking off the cuff, whatever you would like, that's all the kinds of variations that are acceptable, but make sure you practice it at least once. Part of that is because, in my experience and that of many of my peers, is that you build a PowerPoint and it makes sense and you have these images, and then you go to present on them live and you realize like, oh, the connections aren't there or the order is off. I mean, hell, I've given whole lectures in classes where I'm like, sorry, folks, we're going to go to this slide because it made sense when I was building it, but because I didn't get a chance to actually give it live, the logical flow wasn't maybe, or the flow wasn't maybe as logical as it could have been. So yeah, but if you want to have a script, absolutely, right? I don't expect this to be off script. It's not memorized. That's not a component for this class, okay? If it was, I would have warned you all well in advance because that requires extensive preparation to have a memorized speech prepared. Yeah. And also part of it is just realistically speaking, at least in archaeology, when you go to conferences, very few people present off of prepared scripts. Most people just speak off the cuff. So, and you see that probably reflected in your profs, right? Most of your archaeology profs, I don't think any of us in Anthro overall read from recorded or presented scripts. I remember when I was a student, my classics profs always did that. Always. They had formal lectures. And they would come in and, lick their, right? And they had their little post-it note from where they ended last class. And then, I remember one prof, it was mid-sentence. And he'd be like, therefore. And you'd just be like, yeah, I think I've mentioned it before. He was asked, he used to sit in a chair at the front of the class, put his feet up at the desk. And that's how he would lecture for 50 minutes straight, 3 times a week. He would just bring his folder, bring his legal notepad, start reading from it, put his feet back, and every once in a while he'd lean back and write the spelling of a word. If a lot of us kind of were like, excuse me, professor, how do you, and it was classical, world stuff, right? So it was all this Greek and stuff. And we're like, and he'd just be so disgusted, yeah, really noxious. So anyway, so if you want to know why I'm not a classical archaeologist, it's because of him. I blamed him. I was just I don't want to be party people. Anyways, however, that said, when I do go to conferences, it's very common to see student presenters read formal papers and from scripts. That's very common. So again, it's whatever your comfort level is. Yeah. And I rely on notes sometimes too. So great question. Okay. Other questions about the presentation or presentation review? Okay. Yes.
So with our slides, how are we going to set that up? Do we bring a device and connect it? Is it going to be recorded when we're presenting?
This is a great question. So I am going to figure out the recording part. So you folks don't worry about that. Okay. What I would like you to do, and it says in the instructions, I believe, is you need to upload your presentation to Blackboard before your presentation, and I'll have them all queued on my computer. So when you come in, I just pull up PowerPoint. I'm like, okay, our first speaker is, and then I let you come up here, and then you go through your talk, and then okay, next speaker is. Does that make sense? So yeah, so that's why you need to have your time slot and have your presentation uploaded beforehand. Yeah. If worse comes to worse, if for some reason you realize you're oh, I had to add this slide last minute, and even though I uploaded it to Blackboard and you bring USB or something, that's fine as well. Okay. So it's fine. But yeah, because otherwise, if we're switching computers and all of that, we're going to get one presentation done and we need to get a few done. Okay. Does that make sense? And as much as possible, I'll keep to our schedule of speakers we have, but I think one of our days we have a bit of a gap, like 20 minutes between. And so we'll use that. I'll give that time where basically I'll be like, okay, feel free to do peer review right now or something. We'll take a little break or something and do that, get the next presentations up and going, and then we'll go from there. And if people don't need extra time, then we'll just bump you up a little bit of a time slot and just have you go, and then we'll get done early that day. Okay? So great question. Yeah. So yeah, that's why you need to upload, if you're presenting live, your presentation to Blackboard the morning of. I think I said by like 9 a.m. or something. I can't remember what it is, but as long as I get it by basically noon that day, that gives me more than enough time to download them all and have them ready to go and make sure that they work on my computer as well. Because sometimes people do little animations or video clips or links or stuff. I'll make sure that that's all up and going. Okay. And then, yeah, in terms of recording presentation days, I'm going to talk with IT. There's a camera I'm supposed to have access to that I can use to record the space, and so we'll do that. So it's a great question. Did that make anyone else think of any questions or anything? No. Okay. Well, of course, if you have any questions, email me. That's what I'm here for. And I really want to emphasize that, especially as we're going forward into the remainder of the term, that it's really important and critical that you do that. Okay. The last thing we have is, oh, why is this still showing presentation instructions? I must have closed the wrong one. It's just your final project. No, come on. Like, why is Word now? Adobe's not working on my computer anymore. All of a sudden, it's decided it's like, you don't have an account. You're not allowed to use Adobe. I'm like, what? Ugh. This has just been a term, I tell you, folks. A term. Okay, final project. So remember that what you'll be submitting will be determined by the form that you've taken. And really, I'm hoping that for the majority of you, there's a very few of you who are still kind of going back and forth between project and an essay, that hopefully by your presentation, or at least the very latest after your presentation and after you get that feedback, you'll know what you're going into, remember. So I'm not policing the decisions that you're making on this. You can still pivot at any time. Like, let's say you give your presentation and it's a research paper, and then you get feedback from peer, being like, oh, this would have been really cool like this. And you're like, oh my goodness, you're right. That would be really cool like this. Why don't I do it like that? And then you do that. That's fine. Okay. Remember, I don't need, or you don't need my permission to do this. I don't need notice to do this, right? All I need ultimately to get is a final project of some form or another from you, right? Research papers are easy. I just need you to upload them by the final due date. So you'll notice it's April 15th. Okay. If you're doing an essay, if it's not a digital one, if it has a material component, all I ask is that you drop it off to me by then, and I will have some office hours. I think I have it here. Oh yeah, times and dates to be announced. I'll let you know basically. But now that we're back on campus, probably April 15th, I'll be on campus all day. Okay, so you'll just need to swing by my office, probably before, let's say, 3:30 p.m. or something. Again, I'll post this on Blackboard so folks know, right? I'm not going to stay here till midnight to accept your assignment. I'm not that ridiculous. Oh, I am, but I'm also not. This is me trying to have boundaries and self-love. Yeah, I'll be around so you can drop off your projects. And then what usually happens is, after final grades have been submitted, is I'll post a few dates and times where I'll be available for you to pick them up. Some of you just got back yours from last term, and it was just because of everything going on. But if you're worried about getting the material component back, don't worry about it. I will make sure that we can facilitate that and you'll get it back in your hands. Otherwise, I tend to keep or hang on to your own essays, as those of you who've taken classes with me in the past know, and I tend to bring them to classes to use them as examples and inspire potential ideas. But I don't do that without students' permission. So if you're not comfortable with that, not a big deal. Just say, please don't show other folks. Fine, I'll just keep it in my office, or I may discard it and get rid of it too, depending on how much stuff I accumulate over time. I have a nice pile behind my desk right now. I need to figure out what to do. So anyway, so there's that. Okay. The only key thing I wanted to point out about this, of course, is that there's no formal assessment in this as to whether or not you have incorporated peer feedback. That's just something that I just kind of consider in the broader context of your final piece, right? So if, let's say, one of your peers identifies what they see as like a significant oversight that you've made, don't address it in your final work. And I agree that it's a significant oversight because I also noticed that it was an oversight, right? It's that kind of flow of things. And then the form your final project will take will determine how I'm evaluating you. So you'll see that the rubrics are approximately the same. And I'll just mention as well that with unessays, I also have an understanding that they may not be even finished in their final form as well. So some of you have undertaken very ambitious projects, and that's okay as well, right? The goal is to demonstrate learning, while the goal would be to have something that's finished and finalized. As long as you have a plan in place for what an incomplete project or an in-progress project would look like and are able to write it up and discuss the steps you're taking, et cetera, and stuff like that, it should be fine. Okay, so just note also that I won't penalize you if you weren't able to complete it in time, because such is life, right? But also that's the goal. But ultimately, the goal should be that your essay should be completed. Okay, so you'll see the key things are pretty standard for research papers. So yes, there's a couple of marks for overall, format in terms of grammar, the language use and stuff like that. But the significant part of the grade, so 30 marks out of 50, so 60% of your mark, is going to be on the actual content, right? Explicitly, your demonstration of knowledge. So what have you learned about materials? What have you learned about gender and archaeologies of gender this term, right? One of the explicit ways I check for that is, yes, that requirement to incorporate at least one course reading, right, into your work in some means or another, some sort of reference points to it needs to be included into that. But it's also thematically dealing with some of the major concepts we've examined this term, so that can be manifest in a whole bunch of different ways. And then overall, the kinds of materials that you're presenting, at least in a research paper, in terms of analysis, the evidence you're presenting, and then your discussion of those materials. For unessays, it looks a little bit differently because I do want to acknowledge that they are creative pieces. Let's do it this way. Yes, maybe. Are you going to do this way? I don't know. There we go. You'll see that there's a little bit of, there's some marks for, again, not just grammar and style, but design and creativity in your format, right? And this is where I mentioned that it's not that I'm an art critic, right? I'm not evaluating you on your technical skills, right? I, for example, am not a painter. I can look at paintings and appreciate them for what they are, but I'm not going to be like, oh, you were a little heavy-handed on those brush strokes there, right? Okay, so that's not what I'm evaluating there in terms of format, design, and creativity. I'm looking at the piece as a whole and holistically going, is it communicating? Is it resonating something about the topic, the purpose, the intention? Is it speaking to the audience? And again, has there been a reasonable attempt to make sure that that form is appropriate, right? So, if it's a painting, does it look like, yeah, that you actually painted it yourself? Or is it clear that you bought a paint by number kit? And I don't know, right? I'm just trying to say that, like, yeah, this isn't about being an art critique. This is about looking at the relationship of the form you've chosen with the topic, and if it actually communicates in a reasonable way what you want it to communicate. So those of you doing on essays, you'll know that one of the things I've been hitting you on hard about is, where would this on essay be displayed, right? Who's your audience? How are they going to see it? How are they going to access it? How are they going to find it? Think about this online, right? Especially with online pieces, this becomes a really critical piece, right? How do people find blogs, right? How are blogs out there? How are blogs structured? Right? A poster. Well, where is this poster going? Is it an academic audience? Where is this going to be played if it's a game? All of these different kinds of things, right? That's why I ask these sorts of questions. And that would be explained in your little background documents. So that's what you're going to be uploading if you're doing an essay as your final project. Is a little accessory piece, a couple of pages long, where you'll just provide some additional clarification and context for your work. That's where the majority of your references will go, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Any questions about your final projects? And again, my goal is to get all of your peer feedback. What I do is I take the peer feedback I get and I kind of lump it together, and then I give it to you when I give you my grade for your work on your presentation. Does that make sense? Okay. And keep in mind that the peer feedback you get doesn't impact your grade, right? It impacts the feedback you give impacts your grade. Okay. So I do curate the feedback a little bit. So I give you the stuff I think you need to see. And if there's anything that I don't think is appropriate or isn't needed, I won't give it to you, right? So usually it's stuff like, speaker said a lot. Yeah, we all know we all say a lot or all the, right? So I tend to, or speaker looked really nervous. Yeah. Yeah, right? Okay. So I'm pretty sure the speaker is aware that they were shaking, holding their paper, right, as they were giving their talk, right? I know the first time I gave a conference presentation, seriously, folks, and I was like, I have to read it because even though it's my master's work that I just completed, I don't know anything about it, so I better read it, right? And I did this whole time. I think I told you this before, and then I went after I gave my paper, and I sat down, and everyone had left before I gave my paper because right before me was like one of the most famous lithic technologists, Bill Andreski, ever. So there was like 300 people in the room, and he gave his talk. And then he was done, and they're like, as they were announcing me and I was walking up, they're like, our next speaker is, and everyone left. And then, not everyone, but like almost everyone left, and there was like 20 people there. And then I went and sat back down after, and I'm still kind of shaking. And this like older archaeologist, I wish I could remember who she was. I wish I knew who she was. She was just this random lady I was sitting beside. And she just put her hand on my knee, and she was like, dear, you did just fine. And I was like, thank you. Yeah. And then I skipped the rest of the conference that day and went and saw a basketball game. So, okay. So again, I am the old lady at the conference. I'm sure you will all do just fine. Okay. Now Word. Okay, whatever. Let's go here. Okay. Let's talk now. How are we doing for time? I can't see because the.
It's 1:19.
Okay. I've blown through too much time. But it was more important to me that you folks had a good understanding of presentation expectations, final project expectations, peer review, because that's how you're actually being assessed then on content. Okay, so we're going to talk about this now, space and gender. See, are you going to let me go to slideshow? Maybe. Oh. Oh, maybe. Yay. I think. No. Okay, whatever. Okay, I just had a few points I wanted to make around gender and space and landscape archaeology and these approaches. And then what we'll do is we'll break into some small group discussions for the readings and then come back into main group. So we do still have enough time for that. Okay. Yes, there we go. Okay. I don't know if the slides are going to go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so yeah, this is our plan for today, but now it's gone. Anyways. So as I mentioned, I talk about this in other courses. Those of you who've done 206 with me know that the way that I approach and many archaeologists and anthropologists approach space is through understanding the process under which we enculturate spaces, right? In particular, how we change spaces, right? Just physical locations that don't have cultural meaning into places, right? Places of meaning. And one of the most powerful ways that we do this, that this transformation occurs, is through naming, right? And that's why there's a lot of discussion around renaming kind of traditional locations and landmarks and stuff like that. So I know a lot of mountains in British Columbia, they're moving away from some of their colonial names and reintroducing the indigenous place names for those places, right? Thinking about how our political wards here in Edmonton were renamed before the last election, et cetera, right? So naming is one of the ways we do this, but it's also through the narratives we construct, right? The stories that we tell, and it reflects our connection that we have to the land, right? And its various features and attributes, okay? So that's the key thing that we need to then remember as archaeologists first and foremost before we even consider engendering spaces, right? Engendering places is simply first this broader cultural process by which we make these connections and build these connections, those of which are culturally specific, right? And the example I use to show the difference between spaces and places is the simple but powerful distinction we make between a house and a home, right? A house is a building, it's a location, it's something that exists in our landscape, but our home means something, doesn't it? Think about just even the emotions that word evokes, both positive and negative, right? The whole gamut of feelings that comes from a home. I remember when I moved into my apartment, that was the first thing that struck me. I knew I was going to try to rent that because I walked in and I was like, it feels like home already. None of my stuff was in there. I had no connection with this space at all. But I walked into it and immediately was like, this is a place to me. This is somewhere where I think I will be very happy. And it has proven to be such. McEwen was a place, right? Because I grew up at the Big Bad across the river, right? And then I started working at McEwen, and McEwen is now my home. McEwen is much more than a physical space for me. It's much more than the buildings, right? It's much more than all the stuff in it. And I think, in some regards, our shift to online, our forced shift to online, demonstrated some of that. The various ways that we attempted to still maintain our connections with each other, right? To remain together as a community, even when we couldn't gather in a physical environment, right? So I think that these notions aren't hard for us to understand. Indeed, I think they're very simple for us to understand. Where it becomes hard is its application in this context of not only the archaeological record, where we can't ask people what their connection to the land is, right? Yes, we have ethnography, we can apply some of that, but we can't speak directly with individuals necessarily whose remains and material culture we're excavating, right? But it also becomes challenging and then when we start to think about gender and the various ways that we engender spaces along with this as well. So there are a couple of different approaches we can take. Typically in archaeology, when we think about space, we think about spatial analyses. And indeed, this is what we tend to focus on when we teach archaeological methods, right? Is how do we deal with space? Something about one of the first lab exercises we have students do around mapping, right? Where are we? Where is the site located? One of the most important pieces of context is the physical location of the material culture. So again, as archaeologists, spatial analysis is very intuitive to us. It makes sense to us. It seems to have a good fit, right? And from an interpretive perspective, a lot of spatial analyses has focused on kind of the organization of space, right? Has focused on how space is being used and utilized. And I've used previous readings in this course where extensive amounts of time have focused on that. I've actually stepped away from a bit about that as well. Another way we look at this is also looking at the relationships between space and time. And we do this all the time in archaeology, right? We want to know, okay, what's happening at different parts of our site as we excavate down through it? How has it changed over time? Right? My site's in Tanzania. All the surface materials are contemporary material culture. And then as we dig down through, we go from the kind of historical period through the colonial era down into the Iron Age. And then from the Iron Age, if we're lucky, we might have later Stone Age. And then we have Middle Stone Age and then early Stone Age below that, right? So we get this cultural, historical sequence of change in material culture over time, reflecting the people who created these assemblages, right? So again, in archaeology, this is very intuitive, but it's only one approach. The other approach, and the one that is more explicitly connected and linked with archaeology's agenda, is this, the landscape approach. Okay. So landscape archaeology is the study of the ways people in the past constructed and used the landscape around them. So very similar to spatial analysis, right? Whereas as archaeologists, we're attempting to understand that. But with landscape archaeology, we emphasize the human alteration of the land, the cultural modifications to the landscape and the natural environment. And again, getting to the point I started off on, looking at how we transform a natural environment, right, a space, into a cultural environment or a place. So how do we enculturate spaces? Right. In gender archaeologies, this includes as well looking at how landscapes were used to create and to enforce systems of social inequity. Because as you've seen, of course, power and inequity has been a critical theme in archaeology's agenda. Right, so this is one way it's looked at. But also how landscapes and cultural modifications and the construction of cultural environments is used to announce one's status to their community. So it's not just, it's both how one community says this is who we are and it distinguishes our place from your place, right? Or your space, because your space doesn't have meaning to us other than it's not ours, right? but also then how we communicate within our communities, right? These kind of barriers, these kind of notions. Now, landscape archaeology, theoretically speaking, just as a bit of a review for those of you taking archaeology theory, actually has fairly recent origins. It's kind of the 90s. It's the work of people like Tim Ingold, who talked about this, right? Talked about how this transformation of spaces into places through human intervention, through the use of culture, right? But what's important about this is that it recognizes that places are not just material, right? That's one aspect, that the physicality, the environment is only one piece. But it's an important object one. And again, as archaeologists, it's something we can access very easily and readily. But it's also social, right? Because we have these relationships that are very individualized and personalized, right? McEwen means a lot to me. It actually means a lot to my daughter too. She still talks about how she can't wait to come back to McEwen again because she did her daycare here, so this is her school. And she just is like, oh, okay, well, I can't do like elementary school at McEwen, but I'm going to come back to McEwen someday. Yeah, and we were talking about, she was like, well, what do I have to do to become a professor like you? And so I was kind of explaining it to her, and she was like, wow, that seems like a lot of work, but yeah, I think I can do it. Like, to be 9 again, right? Where the world is your oyster. You're just like, I'm just going to conquer and do everything, right? Like, if only we can be that way, right? But we don't have connections to some of the other places as much. Rogers Place, it's a building. I'm looking outside our window and I'm like, more buildings. Some meet Dirtbag. Oh, I had a date at Dirtbag once. It was a nice date. Resulted in a lovely relationship. So I have fond memories of that place, right? Oh, Grizzlars over there. I love their pub, right? Like, but I don't know. They're just buildings. There's places. So it's personalized. It's individualized. Of course, this can be hard to get at archaeologically, right? And it's also cognitive, because part of the reason why we build these connections with the land is because of our experiences, right? So these connections are formed within our minds, right? It's also how we understand our material and social spaces. And our readings this week, at least the one on Dene use, really gets at this, right? The perception of this place and the role of naming, right? The things that kind of unite both spatial analyses and the landscape archaeology approach are actually the methods that we can use. So the methods, the archaeological methods that we use, regardless of what our theoretical approaches, are very similar, right? So we use mapping, we use GIS, we use GPR, ground penetrating radar, and other remote sensing techniques. Of course, excavation, various forms of environmental analyses, right? Pollen analyses, faunal analyses, right? To get at the aspects, the material components of this environment, soil sampling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the methods are the same. It's the theoretical framework, right? It's how we approach our understanding of those materials, our interpretation of those materials, that change and adjust. Now, how do we get to gender? And so I'm trying to be cognitive of time here. I'm lecturing more than I meant to. One of our key figures, we've already read this term, Barbara Voss. Dr. Voss is one of the key figures behind landscape approaches in archaeology, and has as such applied it a lot to gender, right? So some of the work she's done, for example, includes how gender, sexuality, and marriage, and also ethnic, specifically interracial marriages, were mapped onto the landscape of colonial mission sites in California. So who could marry, how they married, who was permitted to marry within colonial missions, Spanish missions in California. She was able to get at that through these contemporary approaches. For example, what she was able to reveal through this study, it's beautiful work, by the way, if you ever want to look this up, revealed that the lived trauma was often concealed by popular romanticized narratives of relationships that were established in these colonial contexts. And we actually see this through some of the colonial master narratives, right? Classic example of this, and I apologize for using her incorrect term, but right, the story of Pocahontas when it was Disneyified. Right, this romanticization of a relationship between colonizer and an indigenous girl, because she was a girl, she was a youth, and it was not a romantic relationship, right? It was a violent one. So that's what Voss's work was able to reveal by examining how these mission sites were utilized, right, and how they were built. And she said that the mission landscape itself becomes then a physical, conceptualized space where heteronormativity, right? So remember, Voss is very heavily influenced and a key proponent of queer archaeologies, and argues that where heteronormativity was explicitly expressed and reinforced. And so actually landscape approaches and landscape archaeologies have been really powerful in archaeologies of gender, right? Of showing these forms of implicit bias that present in works, right? The assumptions of even what a marriage looks like and how spaces can reflect these structures and in some ways control and reinforce these structures as well. So I just wanted to provide some context for all of this as well. One of my favorite aspects of this, there's been some really neat work, again, looking at post-colonial and colonial contexts in the United States, looking at how a lot of colonial mechanisms of arrangement of space and how they often reflect gender structures as well, relate to privacy versus public spaces, but also, and importantly, public versus prohibitive spaces, right? And showing, shifting ideologies around ownership of land, for example, is really well captured in some of this work. So there's really powerful ways of getting at this. Okay, so what I'd like to do, so maybe we won't break into small groups, but instead we can approach this more broadly. Again, I apologize for this. I get critiques on this. Biittner, you said we were going to break into small groups and we were going to do this, and then we never did that. Well, I'm sorry. It's who I am. I wanted to talk about our assigned readings for this week and make some connections with our major text for this term, Battle Baptiste work, which you can see is very heavily informed by landscape approaches, right, to the archaeological record. So, sorry, I'm looking at the time that we've been spending and then the time that's left in class. Okay, we're okay. Okay. So here are some questions for the first one. So Brumbach and Jarvempa, right? I selected this one, as you can see, because of the first question here, is that I saw this was an excellent way to reconnect with two of our previous topics. First, the prevalence traditionally in archaeology of androcentric models, including that of man the hunter. So now we see a clear counterpoint of that, showing the complexity of what hunting looks like in practice, and how it is a gendered activity, but potentially not in the way that these limited man the hunter models presented, right? So that's the key thing, right? It's not that men don't hunt. It's that saying men are the only ones who hunt, and only the labor and work performed by men is the important labor in the purpose of hunting. This article challenges that notion and demonstrates very clearly that's the problem with the model. It's not that men hunt, they do, but rather that the labor they perform is only one part of that. And then this also then intersects with the discussion that you had with Dr. Zetter relating labor and technology, right? And that we see in the construction of the hunt, right, different kinds of activities are needed by various gendered individuals within the community to support this critical subsistence practice, right? And that, I think, is the major shift we see with archaeologies of gender in critiquing these earlier models, is this recognition, right? Is honestly much more anthropological, isn't it? Because it's much more holistic in their approaches and understandings of these key activities, right? Okay, so what are some key things that you folks have seen from this? So I kind of answered the first question for you, right? So how do they define space? What is their approach to landscapes? And feel free to answer any of these. What is the main method that they use to understand the gendered use of space by the Dene? And then this is probably the easiest entry point into this article. Or, okay, well, what are some of the activities that are being done by men and women in the context of space, right? What are the activities they're doing? How are they using spaces differently? And what happens when there's overlap, when men and women are using the same spaces? Are they using them the same? Are they using them differently? So thoughts? Anyone? We don't need hands in here. Tell me what you thought. And you're all like, Biittner, we barely read anything. We are exhausted. We have so much work to do. That's okay. So what are some notes or thoughts here? You can answer whatever one you want. You just tell me. You're like, in answer to this, this is what I have to say. Or your takeaway from the article. I actually really like this one a lot. I find it very accessible too in so many ways. It's very engaging. So what is the method they use, by the way? Yeah.
From what I can understand, there's a bit of a mix.
Yeah.
Of, like, talking to people, getting their experiences. I've sorry, the word for that escapes me.
Ethnoarchaeology.
There you go.
No problem.
And
Yeah.
then they were also looking at prior work that had been done.
Absolutely.
And mapping of all of the hunting areas.
Yeah.
It's quite neat. They kind of, I think they took the space as the people themselves defined it.
Yeah.
And that's how they explored it.
Yeah. So yeah, so exactly. So in terms of methodologies, we see not just one, but a number. The kind of the umbrella approach that they're taking, the kind of critical one is ethnoarchaeology, right? So they're actually working with, living, engaging with, and doing research with Dene people, right? And like you said, importantly, getting their idea, right? So they're not defining place, they're not defining spaces as the researchers. They're saying, what is this place? What is this space? How are you using it, right? So it's based on their informants or interlocutors, right? Understandings and construction of that, right? So that's part of the approach. And then, like you said, then they use some traditional methods of mapping, for example, to show the distribution of material culture across these particular places identified. Yes.
I thought it was kind of interesting how after they introduced like schools, basically like colonized, I guess. Like it changed the spatial organization of like men and women.
Yeah.
And then it changed the archaeological like record of it.
Yeah.
So like they would find in Anth like where women were more like confined to like one space, having to be at home like take care of like kids and their schooling and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But they would still do their like daily tasks. They found like more of a concentration of like material culture.
Yeah.
Like of women. And then less of men because they would travel so far and for like 2 days to like 2 weeks.
Exactly.
They're unable to like get as much record of like any hunting or anything like that, which I thought was kind of interesting. Just to like further prove that like women, even a part of their daily task was like trapping.
For sure. Yeah, and I think the whole like so many great points you made in there that like so first and foremost we have to remember that when we see shifts then in things like the archaeological record, we have to think about what some of those causes might be, and this is a case where we see explicitly how colonial structures and institutions are shaping the archaeological record because they're managing and controlling the movement of people, and in this case in a very specific kind of explicit gendered sort of way, right? Whether this was an intended consequence or not, it was definitely one that we see. And then the second piece regarding the movement of people as well, how that can either contribute to or not the invisibility of certain kinds of behaviors and patterns, right? And this is something that we're constantly trying to get at in archaeology, is the movement of people, right? How can we actually track this and see what happens? Because the archaeological record can only develop in cases of stasis, right? Where people are staying in a location, right? We actually a common interpretation when we find like isolated finds, like just a random arrowhead or a random something or other here or there, is the idea that it was probably lost in transit, right? Is when it doesn't have a specific context, we have those interpretations. Yeah. So some great points there. Yeah.
It just made me think my aunt is Dene,
Mm-hmm.
and she's the one who like cans and skins and everything, and but like my uncle will still help, but everyone knows that like it's that she's the expert, and it's not that he's not allowed in the space to help, but like she knows she's been doing this for like years and years, and so like it's not that it's like he's not allowed in that space, but she's the expert in it, so just reading this kind of like cemented that.
Really cemented that, yeah. And I think that's a great point too, right? Is about how places and spaces become engendered may not necessarily be because they're explicitly being said, like how we do, how open sign and be like, women's washroom only, right? And we patrol and police and manage those spaces explicitly. But in some cases, it might simply be because that's where the expertise lies. And if we think about, again, if we harken back to looking at technologies and stone tools, for example, and this is a comparable thing where that particular craft, that particular skill is a form of technological knowledge that's transmitted in a gendered sort of way. So again, it's not that men are not welcome to participate in this process, but it's a form of knowledge that's held in a particularly gendered way, and the expertise then lies with those gendered individuals, right? And that's something that maybe isn't actually as captured as well in this as well, right? Like they hint at it and allude at it, but I think it's something we have to consider, right? What is contributing to this? Yeah. So that's a key thing, right? Is it's not that these spaces are being explicitly engendered by people, but that spaces might be being used concurrently for different kinds of activities in different kinds of ways, and that there may be movement through these engendered spaces, right, of other gendered individuals, just because that's how society works, right? It's not always necessarily prohibitive as it can be. I've assigned another paper in the past where it actually is. There's explicit prohibitions around gendered kind of based activities and stuff like that, and there's reasoning for that. Good. Okay. The other paper I assigned to you folks was Nikolai, and the reason why I assigned this, as you can imagine, is it provides to me an interesting comparison and contrast with the work of Vatel Baptiste, right? Where here is clearly a case of the kind of European perspective of what it's like to establish a homestead site in the Americas, right? Particularly in an American context, in the case of the Merriman's homestead. And it also illustrates some really critical pieces that regard to things like status and class, right? And they do a really excellent job, or Nikolai does, of talking about this, about, again, this manipulation or transformation of the farmhouse and its grounds over time that are reflective of changes in status over time as well. And to me, that really, again, makes kind of some explicit connections with the work of Vatel Baptiste and looking at and applying her plantation landscape model, right? We're looking at how the plantation itself has transformed and changed over time and is reflective of not just, the kind of traditional dichotomy between, those who own, like slavers, right? People who own slaves and the slaves, or the disenfranchised people, or people. I'm trying to think what the proper term we're using now, not for, because slaves strips people's agency, right? It's another term we use now, and I'm blanking on it. Yes?
It's just enslaved.
It just enslaved. Thank you. Enslaved people. Thank you. Okay. Language matters, right? Words matter. So I want to, yeah, so enslaved people versus people doing the enslavement, right? And I also like this one as well because it touches upon, as does the work of Vatel Baptiste, this concept and construction of home. Okay, so rather than talking about this specifically, and I gave you some reviews in the notes here, let's just jump forward a bit and let's look at some of these connections, right? So how are some of the different ways that home are constructed, we might say now, on the basis of these different identities, right? So in both of these pieces, in both chapter 2 and in Nikolai, they're both talking about the construction of home and home spaces by women, right? But these are different kinds of women. They have different ethnicities, and most importantly, most critically, different classes, right? In the American landscape, right? So how is home constructed differently than by these women? What does home mean to them, perhaps we might say? And how might we understand that from this archaeological perspective? Hoping that some of you in Dr. Prince's historical archaeology class would have some insights, because this is hardcore historical archaeology, this kind of work. It's not the stones I'm used to. I know that it's one of the struggles that I have as someone who will at least traditionally used to study, like the origins of our species. Getting at gender is extremely difficult, right? So I actually basically just degender everything I do. There are no genders of my tool makers in Tanzania. They're just people making tools to survive. And hopefully they were able to pass on their genes and contribute to the populations we see today, is what it looks like they were able to. I don't think I mentioned this, but my friend Elizabeth just published an article in Nature again. Of course she did, Dr. Sawchuk. And it turns out that the skeleton I helped her excavate at our site at Malambalazi now represents the oldest ancient DNA that's ever been recovered from an African archaeological site. Therefore, basically some of the oldest DNA in the world, probably, if not in the world, period. I think the Neanderthal stuff is actually a little bit older than ours, but they're Neanderthals and not anatomically modern humans, so whatever. They're not us. Yeah, so she and her team just published a very comprehensive look. It's one of the most thorough examinations of ancient DNA in the world. Yeah. So, anyways, kicking ass and taking names. Any thoughts on this? No? Yes, thank you.
I don't have any specific thoughts relating to the questions up on the board.
Yep.
But I was just kind of noticing in Battle Baptiste, one of the women looked at, she owned her house, right?
Yeah.
And then we're also examining this homestead that was owned by the women,
Yeah.
not the men living on it. And I just thought that was an interesting parallel.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it's interesting to look at that as well about the power of ownership and what that means, right? Actually having that tangible, no, this is our space that we can transform into a place of meaning that reflects the various aspects of our identity. And I think that's the power of the Nikolai article, right? Is it very clearly is showing the women making choices around the gardening, right? The landscape itself and even the furniture and components within the house and how that can be an act of power.
They were both also very involved in their surrounding communities, right? Like they were kind of big names in the community.
For sure. Yeah. Yes.
This was just out of the Nikolai writing. I remember seeing in it how she was like Ella Sharp and her husband John. They were gifted chairs for their wedding, and they were both gentleman chairs.
Yeah.
So it like showed that Ella was on like the same social kind of standing as her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And like outside of that, there are like there's a lot of parts of their home that does represent, I guess, like womanhood. Like with the piano and like the garden, and then also with like having the leisure time to mess with the garden.
Yeah.
For like upper class women.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the point about the garden is really important too. So yeah, great point around the equity that's represented through the gifts, through the marital act, right? Where it could have been easily a case where it might have been transformed otherwise, right? Like she's now property of her husband, etc. And we don't see that. But the whole thing about this leisure time, and that's I think to me was one of the important contrasts that comes out about this, is that, you know, the transformation of the home space on the plantation context in particular, right? It was out of necessity, right? Providing additional food resources, right? Providing a sense of community and support while under this kind of enslaved context, right? So, whereas, the Merriman women, the leisure that came with their class and standing is really critical, right? That ability to not labor, where gardening becomes a joy or a pleasure versus something that's required for subsistence practice, right? And so that's where some of those class distinctions can start to come out, is when we start to look at, like what sort of activities are being performed and how they're manifest in these landscapes and what they symbolize in terms of these various roles that people are playing, right? And the ability to garden for fun and pleasure versus for subsistence practice is a really critical one. And there's actually some really interesting dialogue about that coming out of COVID because of how many of us become, like plant parents in the context of COVID. Yeah, comment or question.
I just wanted to mention about the chair thing. It made me giggle, honestly, when I read it. So I was like, who would do that? Who would purposely gift a gentleman chair with I don't think that was the intent. And it's just funny to me that in the work that we're doing, those are the things we look at. Like, what's the symbolism behind this?
Yeah.
Because if you're giving somebody a chair, you're giving them a comfy chair. You're probably not giving them a chair that symbolizes their status as an equal in the household. Like, there probably wasn't that thought, but maybe there was.
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting to me to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's always the risk of archaeology. And I guess that'd be like one of the parting messages I would give you folks regarding archaeology's agenda, right? Is just how much I've emphasized this importance of kind of de-engendering before we start to engender the past, right? We kind of have to strip away our notions, is that sometimes a rock is just a rock, folks, okay? And one of the risks we have now in archaeology is not only over-analyzing the material culture, but sometimes reading into things what's not necessarily there. And so we always have to be cognizant of that fact. So that's why the strength of our argument is so critical, right? Whether it was intended or not of the giftee, right, to symbolize this. The reality is this is how it's being read, right? Even if not in the contemporary context, now in a future context, people are looking back on it and interpreting it in this way, right? So that's the thing, is sometimes like the kind of some symbolism, I guess, of some of these distinctions is not really, the nuance of it may not be really understood until that later kind of interpretation does occur, right? And I think Battle Baptiste work consistently shows this, right? That, again, the idea about how these kind of things, we can bring them to light, we can make them more explicit, right? Her discussion of what people were doing on the homesteads, how they're creating their households, the care they took in the yard. I always think about the yard space in the plantation model, right? About the importance of keeping it swept clean and stuff, the pride that comes from that. Yes, that's part of the narrative of the time, but that's something that now, in hindsight, also has even greater symbolic meaning and expression, because now we understand so much more. And I mean, we in the collective, right, know so much about what was going on in those contexts, about how much power dynamics were happening, the oppression, the violence, and stuff like that. It's not that people didn't know it at the time, but we do have some of that benefit to look at, and it does then make things so much more symbolic and significant when it comes from it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think maybe at that time, if she were to be gifted that, maybe her friend would be like, "That's really weird that you don't have a chair without armrests and isn't pink and cute." She's like, "Yeah, I'm just so comfortable."
Yeah, it might have been insulting, right? Maybe it was a dig that maybe someone saw her as too manly, right? These are the kind of, because as someone who was formerly married and being gifted stuff, and something like, I know that gift wasn't for me, right? That was not intended for me. We all know who was getting that, right? And you can read those slights into it and stuff. So it's interesting how, in hindsight, as archaeologists, we start to get these other kinds of interpretations. Okay, well, thanks everyone. It was great to see you all. Thanks for your discussion today. Looking forward to seeing presentations next week. That'll be really exciting. And again, if you have any questions about any of this stuff that you're expected to do as we wrap up the term, please don't hesitate to contact me. Okay, I'm taking appointments. I can meet over video. Depending on what your schedule is like, just let me know. And I'll see you all on Thursday.